Welcome back to Mini Lessons Made Easy. My name is Courtney Brown, and today we'll be continuing our lesson series on the Shakespearean play Romeo and Juliet. This video is framed within the context of a series which will be exploring different ways to engage students with the text in creative ways. I've situated this video around probably week 2, day 3 on Romeo and Juliet so that students already have the background and are ready to dive into analysis. So today we'll be exploring light and dark motifs within Romeo and Juliet through 3 different passages. I'll show exactly what you need to do to have a successful lesson. We've already discussed the historical background of Romeo and Juliet, so go ahead and refer to that video if you have any questions. I'd love to spend a moment discussing why we study Shakespeare with students. So Lori Gray, in her article, Why You Should Study Shakespeare, discusses the importance of why we teach this material in your classroom. We look to Shakespeare to make meaning of our experiences. His character and themes live within each of us. Shakespeare's plays and poems still matter to us because his plot still resonates, his characters still leave their mark, and his language still moves and startles. Making that connection for students will create the buy-in you need to spark an interest into digging deeper in the content. This lesson will be an excellent opportunity to show them how their relationships can even look similar to Romeo and Juliet's struggle, whether in a positive or a negative context. Not being allowed to be together, and in this case, one individual pulling the other towards the light or towards darkness creates the epic reality of this inevitable failure. Without further ado, let's get into some content. So I'm going to walk you through kind of the basic structure of the document first. And here you see we've listed the state standards. I'm currently located in Mississippi, so those are the standards that I've listed here. And then I've listed the teaching unit topic here based on these standards. So there's some space if you'd like to change or alter that. And I've also included the teaching purpose and learning goals here for this lesson in my unit, but I've left plenty of space so that you can put your content in there as well. So what you're seeing here on your screen right now is a bell ringer activity that would take the first 5 to 10 minutes of your period. So students would simply write the attributes of both light and dark on either side just to get their brains thinking in the realm of comparison. So obviously their name, their grade, 11th grade is what this lesson is kind of geared towards. So what comes to your mind when you think of light and dark, and then really having them explain, well, why do you think that? Instilling those creative or critical thinking skills. So then they'll find 3 quotes that depict the light, 3 that depict the darkness, and 3 that they're together. And there are plenty of lists you can pull from online, or just kind of looking through the text and examining what that looks like. And then there are 2 sections here, and if time allowed, you could continue for your students to finish more quickly, or kind of adapt it and save this part for another day, depending on your time. And these ideas are all tied to the Mississippi Career Readiness Standards to make connections to the objectives really clear. So I'm going to scroll back up to the presentation content section. Yeah, here we go. For the lesson portion itself, I love doing a think, pair, share activity in groups to compile a good working list of the light and dark attributes. And for those of you that don't know, a think, pair, share activity is you're thinking of ideas on your own, you're pairing up with a partner, and then you're sharing what you learned or what you think about that activity. So from that, they'll compile a good working list of light and dark attributes from their share groups. And this is an excellent segue into the presentation of content. So here we are looking at that section of the Launchpad document. And this was a document, the Launchpad, that was adapted for the state of Mississippi just to kind of make a lesson plan more cohesive, but feel free to take it, copy and paste it. The link for this document is down below. So starting with some good definitions from sources to build the definition of light and dark imagery for students, according to Thomas Tansell's Time in Romeo and Juliet, light is the embodiment of goodness and truth. So that would go on one side of your chart. Then on the other side of the chart, you would put the darkness. But light is seen in areas such as how Romeo compares Juliet to the light. And then another source, according to Amit Sabatier, the darkness is embodiment of evil, mystery, or fear. This idea is seen in how Romeo and Juliet interact under the cloak of darkness. This is a really good spot to write these definitions on the board. Make sure their working definition encompasses elements from reliable secondary sources. You can also refer to my video on source reliability and good research methods if you need to review with your class. The story of Romeo and Juliet is one that students will most likely have a basis of knowledge for. I mean, at this point in my unit, they've been reading it for a week and a half. So they have basis of knowledge for this epic love story. But what we're really going to focus on is how do you get students to form opinions on this topic and really analyze specific passages of the text centered around this one idea. This relates to Shakespeare as a genre through digging into one specific area of analysis. Light and dark is such a juxtapositional concept. At face value, it makes good sense. But allowing students the space to complicate these concepts through 3 specific textual excerpts will deepen their understanding of why this concept is so important. The 3 excerpts I will use are as follows. We have Act 1, Scene 5, which is the ball scene. We have Act 2, Scene 2, which is the balcony scene, and Act 3, Scene 2, which is highlighted under the death foreshadowed. So for Act 1, Scene 5, I recommend putting this passage on the projector and walking through the analysis components together. This is a scene where Romeo and Juliet meet at the ball that takes place at the beginning of Act 1. After the initial meeting under the cloak of darkness, the two run away together with the protection of night, away from the people that seemingly want to tear them apart. Look for students to notice things like how Romeo continually calls Juliet the sun. It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious man who is already sick and pale with grief. This is important because Romeo is the one who draws her to the darkness. This would be a great place to give students one of the quotes to work with as a class and discuss it. I've included some quotes you could use in this section here. So at that point, I would separate the class into 2 groups, one finding quotes in the play connected to the definition of light, and the other connecting to the definition of darkness, maybe related to their definitions from the bell ringer activity and the think, pair, share activity from the top of the presentation of content right here. So discussion as a class could create a richer discussion. Time as a whole to go into details. It shouldn't take more than 5 to 10 minutes, but you could use it to see where you need to backtrack as a check for understanding. I've included some options for quotes you could do with this activity. You could do this activity more than once with your students to make sure they really understand what's happening, or you could do it just once. So there are the quotes there. All right, let's go ahead and move on to Act 2, Scene 2, which is the balcony scene. So this is going to kind of focus on the quote that we kind of already touched on in the first section, East and Juliet is the sun. And this quote is an excellent segue into their individual worksheet, discussing the tie to light and dark. You could have students consider things like deep emotions and feelings, and if these things connect to the darkness. So Romeo possesses a deep feeling of this fairy tale love of the girl that he is forbidden to be with. He feels his love deeply in his core, so students can notice the language he uses to express his love for Juliet and how that affects their relationship. Students can also discuss the pattern of opposites within the play. If Juliet is the sun, Romeo is the moon. Look for opposites to discuss as other opposites to discuss as well. Students may notice the role of family groups, such as the familial divide of Capulets and Montagues. Jonathan Culpeper, in his journal Words, Parts of Speech, and Semantic Categories in Character Talk of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, discusses different linguistic occurrences of different patterns within the play, such as the connection to happiness and unhappiness, and its connection to the two different houses, and the fact that Romeo and Juliet are not allowed to be together. I've highlighted some other things you can talk about with your class, such as the foreshadowing of death and how light changes into darkness as death grows closer. Something that my class did with this kind of activity several weeks ago is love or infatuation, and that was really created a nice, rich discussion with students. So what that kind of looked like was focusing on the fact that Romeo idolizes Juliet as a perfect heavenly figure that can do no wrong. And my students discussed whether love at first sight exists and how do the emotional aspects of the play, such as love and hate with their families, change Romeo's approach to loving Juliet, or not loving her, depending on how you look at it. The last scene you could look at in this lesson is Act 3, Scene 2, which is Death Foreshadowed. The knowledge that the sun and the moon, so Romeo and Juliet cannot see each other, is the thing that creates the tragic ending. The darkness overwhelms the light by the end of the play. More light, and more dark, and dark are woes. And this quote is an excellent section to push student thinking on how light changes into darkness as death grows closer. At the beginning of the play, Romeo discusses Juliet as the sun compared to none, fair and beautiful. By the end of the play, Juliet is willing to give up everything for Romeo, even if it means dying, so she does not have to live in a world where he doesn't exist. Students can discuss relevant topics such as toxic relationships, disobeying parents, dating the wrong person because they said, in quotes, that they like you, and even suicide. Know your class and ultimately choose the topic you feel would best facilitate the discussion. As kind of a recap activity, a check for understanding, or an exit ticket, you could do discussion groups on findings in the passage, or possibly do strongly agree, strongly disagree with these light and dark perceptions. Strongly agree, strongly disagree is one of my new favorite ways to do checks for understanding. And what that would look like is I take 2 8x10 pieces of paper, one would strongly agree, one would strongly disagree, and put them on opposite sides of the room. And so you would read off the questions. I've kind of listed some questions here, so you'd read them off and ask students if they strongly agree or strongly disagree with the statement. And then they'll go to the side of the room if they agree with it, and go to the other side, the opposite side of the room, if they disagree with it. And basically, they would just need to justify and defend their stance at that point. And it kind of gets them thinking critically in a fun way. There are several really cool adaptations of this. We've done it so 3 students are the judge, and they vote on which stance had a better argument, and that was defended with evidence, just all sorts of different ways. So I've listed questions here so you could adapt your own statements. And this activity is best done with statements, so they can disagree or agree with the statement. So you could say Romeo is the darkness, kind of based on the statement. Strongly agree or strongly disagree. Students would then defend, well, Romeo said this in Act 1, Scene 2 about Juliet being the sun. All right, cool. So what does the other side have to say about that? And just kind of going along with that kind of critical thinking skill. I've included a section here for details and guiding questions. And those will be specifically based on your unit. So making sure you had space for originality there as well as your classroom accommodations. So your students with IEPs and 504 plans, you could include that here as well. So I've included kind of a closure activity here based on some research that I did for this unit. One of the sources was Ruth Nevo, a well-known author and commentator on Shakespearean works, explains the different facets of Shakespearean tragedy across several different plays. And this kind of secondary research is a great opportunity to scaffold students for possible research papers based on their mini lessons of figurative language. But to close out this mini lesson, I would have students complete the attached worksheet, which we're going to look at in a minute, and go over it the next day as a summative assessment. So we're going to go down here. And this document is adapted from Teachers Pay Teachers, and if you don't know what that is, you definitely should. It's a teaching lifesaver. So we've listed that Act 2, Scene 2 passage right here for students to read through and just circle light and dark imagery within the passage and then answer these questions. I've also included an answer key so that you kind of have an idea of how to structure it. And this document is completely editable so that you can adapt it for your classroom as well. And you could have students do this as homework or as a check for understanding or as their exit ticket for the day. Totally up to you. Lots of different options. So thank you so much for tuning into my channel. If you like this video, subscribe for more content just like this. Next week, I'll be doing the 12 Days of Tragedy in preparation for the Christmas season. You won't want to miss it as we look through some of Shakespeare's most notable tragedies. Thanks so much. See you next time.